Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So on this episode of the special report, we want to look at what's happening with Russia, the Nord Stream pipelines 1 and 2, and then what are some of the ramifications, because they've issued a Ukrainian vote, and we want to talk about what does that mean and how is that going to impact some of the fighting that continues to happen along the southeastern front. So just kicking it off. So obviously, for those that haven't seen it, the Nord Stream 1 and 2 have a massive leak. Their sabotage is the likely culprit at this point in time, and the reason why we say that is because it's a 4-inch thick pipe with 11 inches of cement around it to protect it. Because if you remember, for those from the U.S., there was the oil leak in California, and it came from an anchor dragging across it and causing a hole. Now, this is built so that does not happen. That is the point of the cement. It's 100 meters down, so there's a lot of protection that is done to ensure that they're stable, there's no issues. So the fact that this happened to not one, but 2 of these pipelines obviously leads to questions around what happened and why. Now, there was gas still in the pipeline, so it's going to take essentially through the weekend, shows by about Sunday, early Monday, the gas that was left in the pipeline should be released, and that will be able to put eyes on what happened. Now, the sabotage could have happened from within, and what you would do is you would put a pig down or some sort of explosive device, send it through the pipeline, and detonate it from the inside, or you could try to do something from the outside. Obviously, the direction of the blast is going to be indicative of where did it originate from. You might think, why would they do this? And the running joke has been, well, the U.S. divers and Russian divers bunked heads on their way down and decided to divide and conquer. But realistically, it's a split on who did it and why. And you can play different games in terms of game theory on who would be the main culprit behind it. From a Russian perspective, you could say, well, it takes away a lot of bargaining power, just because depending on the type of damage, this could take months, years, or they may never be able to be replaced, just given the damage. And now that is unlikely, just because you would just have to remove a very large portion of it and then relay it. Not to say that that isn't massively expensive. Plus, once the pressure exits and all of the gas is gone, that will be backfilled by salt water. And obviously, salt water and steel don't exactly mix, especially when you're moving a lot of natural gas through it. So you'd have to repair it, then blow out the pipeline, and then make sure that there isn't any contamination left, whether that be salt and or water. So when you look at Russia, this takes away their bargaining power, but you could say that if Putin is feeling pressure that people are going to force him to either come to an agreement, or if somebody follows him, this is no longer an avenue they can go down. So it at the same time, it takes away the bargaining chip and forces Russia to continue to fight and not try to come up with some sort of solution. It also opens up the opportunity to show that they can strike any of the energy assets in the region. So that is something that is possible. And if you look at where the issues are, it's just outside of EEZ zones. Because if you remember, if there is a strike on NATO sovereignty soil, which is identified as as extending to the EEZ zone, you could say, well, that's gonna declare the article. If Russia is found culpable, then that would trigger the NATO article and force some sort of action. Now, because it happened technically in international waters, there's a lot of that plausible deniability. And at the same time, it avoids a NATO trigger. So there's a lot of pieces that can happen with that, which, because of where it was done, you could say that was very much a Russian entity. It also creates the pressure on, if it's not going to be used anyway, might as well take it out and again show that strength. From the U.S. perspective, you could say that it hurts Russia in the long run, but at the same time, it's something that is going to stress the European system. And would the U.S. really risk doing something like that in terms of fracturing NATO unity, Western unity? And the same could be said about some of the Nordics, because it just so happens that at the time this pipeline came on, another just entered service. Coming from the Nordics down into Europe. So you could say it's like, well, the timing is convenient. So they, the Europe decided that this was the last resort as some replacement came on. Again, it's unlikely that would be the case. I would obviously default to say that this was some sort of Russian operation, but again, it's gonna take time to really go through those different pieces. But there are other pipelines, not only in this region, but other, as well as internet connections and all other types of infrastructure. So we expect to see more patrols there. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark have talked about increasing their military presence when it comes to around gas fields, around refiners, around any type of energy infrastructure, because again, this is trying to protect against other pieces. So we will see more patrols, especially when you start looking at throughout the Baltic Sea, because this is going to become obviously a big flashpoint. And as more military vessels enter the waters, there's always a increased risk of something happening. But just to be clear, these two pipelines are now fully inoperable. So even if Russia were to leave Ukraine and things get back to some sort of normalcy, this is not something that is going to be fixed the day that happens. You're talking about an extended period of time, a lot of pain, a lot of pressure that is not going away anytime soon. Now, one of the interesting things that, again, while all of this is happening, which is why it all starts to match up when you put all of the different pieces together, when you look at the pro-Russians claim victory and annexation votes in Ukraine. So regions where votes on becoming part of Russia were held by Moscow between September 23rd to the 27th is in that shaded area. So this is a view that they're going to take this just like they did with Crimea and the Donetsk, and they're going to use this and they're going to annex 4 provinces of Ukraine tomorrow, Friday the 30th, following these referendums. Now, if you believe these referendums were a fair vote or were not just some sort of rubber stamp, I have some great oceanfront property in Oklahoma to sell you. So clearly this was something that was obviously done. But the reason why this is so important is because Putin had said that they're going to put the nuclear option back out there on any Russian territory. So that's the key piece, on any Russian territory. So if they claim these 4 regions as Russian territory and not Ukrainian, well, now as Ukraine continues to fight to free areas that have been taken over by Russian forces, that technically opens up the opportunity for Putin to deploy a nuclear entity. And that's where again, all of this is kind of is happening back to back to back in terms of the different structures, in terms of how he is trying to position himself to extend that nuclear threat and that nuclear umbrella. And this is a pivotal piece for it, because right now, again, not to say that he would have to answer to anyone, but he could say, well, now that they're part of the Russian Federation, it now opens us the opportunity where we can use this against the aggression of the Ukrainian military, because these are now recognized, voted by the people to become part of Russia, which is, again, a big piece. And it's a strategic shift. Because if you look at what has happened to this point, the Ukrainians have made a lot of inroads, especially when you look at Lugansk and that movement sideways. That's why they wanted to, as the pressure continues to mount, they're trying to find new ways to increase against that umbrella. Now, as we all know, there was an increase in subscription, so they've called up reserves. There was a leak that had 1.4 million names. There was this first round is about 300,000, but again, this is stage one of a multi-stage mobilization, which is something that we have seen. The problem is the equipment that these individuals, or I should say the benefit for Ukraine problem from Russia, the equipment that is being disseminated is rusted, it's old, it is not up to standard, and that has brought back commentary around World War II, when one Russian soldier was given a rifle, the other one a bag of ammo, and if one died, the other one would pick it up. And it's just, you're seeing, again, just more what seems to be just bodies to put in front of on the front lines to try to hold this, which is why bringing in that nuclear capacity is, I think, in Putin's mind, or at least the government's mind, to try to create that umbrella and to try to rebel some of the advances that the Ukrainians have made. So then when you look at the assessed control, this is where you look at Kharkiv and that whole movement down, there has been a significant amount of essentially retrenching. And when you look at the pockets of resistance, that's why when you think about the referendum passing, it's like, okay, well, with what infrastructure? Because the whole place has been ripped apart. And just based on the infighting that has happened, it's unlikely that there was enough to actually get that passed, especially because a lot of this failed back in 2014. Now, when you look at Russian military leadership has likely failed to set information conditions for the potential defeat of Russian forces in Liman, despite increasingly concerned discourse among Russian bloggers regarding local bloggers regarding its potential envelopment by Ukrainian forces. So when you look at it, you can, and we'll zoom in the next slide, you can see that there's been a significant advancement. And again, it's just because when you look at what the Russians have, they don't have the resources. And when you look at the surveillance, they're using old tactics of surveillance, which essentially forward deployment, because they don't have air superiority, because they have limited drones. And we've actually seen the suicide drones, which were created most recently and deployed in Iran, are being deployed here. And it just shows that they don't have the ability to gain the type of intelligence that the Ukrainian military has been working with, which has been supported by not only NATO, but also U.S. equipment, with another round of spending. I think another 1.1 billion has been slated to go towards the Ukrainian military in their fight against Russia. So as the Ukrainians continue to push down, the view is if they can push this referendum through, that would increase the nuclear umbrella and hopefully stop the advancements. So now when you look at some of the advancements in general, here you can see that on the left, Kherson and Mykolaiv, you can see that the Ukrainians continue to push down. They have taken a significant step in terms of moving this through, especially in the Kherson Oblast, and really cutting off a significant amount. And then they would be able to meet in the middle and free a lot of these areas, and that would reconnect to some very important areas when you look of how it relates to the Azov Sea, and again creating that capacity. And this is another reason why they're trying to get some drum up, trying to show that, especially to the Russian people, look, they want to be part of Russia. They are Russian. So we really need to go and defend our brothers and sisters because they want to be part of Russia. And again, it's a lot of marketing and it's a lot of strategy in terms of that nuclear umbrella. Now, there has been some advancements by the Russians when you look at the Donetsk Oblast, trying to move that forward. But as you can see, what Russia has been able to gain and what the Ukrainians have been able to gain are vastly different. And it's because the Ukrainians have the offensive, they have the momentum, and the Russians are trying to stop that. And one of those key issues is by using that nuclear option. Now, when you look at the flight of Russians from Russia, so one of the first things that happened, which is why timing is always relative, is always relevant. When you look at the announcement from Putin in terms of the call up of assets, you can see that they stopped allowing men to leave by border, by driving train, and force them back. And that was even before Putin made commentary. Now, after the commentary came out, it was a full stop, but you could still buy one-way plane tickets out of Russia. So we saw a huge surge, and they sold out almost instantly for people looking to leave the Russia and taking one-way tickets. And a significant amount of them have obviously moved into Finland, into other European nations as a way of fleeing the forced conscription that is coming down. And when you look at the leak of about 1.4 million individuals, this clearly is just stage one. But now with the one-way tickets now officially being sold out, now the next round, they are not allowing anybody of fighting age to buy these one-way tickets because they want to keep them in their location. There have been some protests against the forced conscription. There has been fighting on those that have been called. They come and get you, and there's been pushback on that. But they have now made it where I think it's a 10-year jail prison sentence if you protest against the war and if you fight conscription. So again, they're trying to bring this and increase the body count in terms of what can go to the front lines. And now it's important to talk about what's happening in Iran as well. So there has been a series of protests triggered by the death of Masa Amini. And for those that don't know what happened, there is a let's call it a religious force that force the way they wear their cover their hair, cover their face, and she was killed or beaten essentially to death based on the local regime's enforcement piece, but it's men and women that enforce this. So once this happened, and it's happened before, this created a bigger issue and has sparked a significant amount of protests. And now, just to be clear, it's called the morality police, but it's really a part of the IRCG and trying to keep control. And it's been moving into a bigger movement, uniting all corners of society and calling for regime change. And this is just showing you a quick map of just how big these protests have gotten. And if you look at regime change and if you look at what happens in general, there's usually a rallying cry and there's usually a unifying factor. And sometimes it seems like someone that not to say that she isn't important, because obviously she is, but this has happened before. It's just a matter of when have the people had enough, and then essentially grab onto the most recent one, which is like, look, enough is enough. We've had how many deaths before? She needs to be the last one that happens. So there have been several deaths during the protests. There have been live fire usage of the IRCG and the morality police trying to put down the uprisings. But again, they are only seeming to grow in momentum. And there's a lot of anger there. There's food shortages. There's no jobs. There's limitations on just availability. And again, if you don't wear your hijab in the right way, does that mean that you're going to be killed? And again, this is why there's a huge pushback. And it's impossible to tell which event will drive that regime change. We do believe that there is going to be a pivot in their politics. Do I think it's this one? I don't know. I would have said that it would have happened a bit sooner, just given the amount of intelligence that is leaking out of Iran. I thought it would have been a bit sooner, but again, it's just going to be a matter of when do they get enough support, when do they get focused enough, and when does that drive happen, and when do people at the top want to preserve their own power and are willing to make some changes and some, but again, it's near impossible to tell, which is the unfortunate piece as we continue on. But there's going to be more bloodshed. There's going to be more protests. And the IRCG has already shown they are willing to be very violent in their approach to try to put down these protests. People have actually been using Starlink because they've taken down the internet, they've taken down means of communication. But again, it's just another spot that is continuing to see a rise in an uptick in protests, which if you've listened to us since last year in 2020, we've been saying that as we come out of COVID, there's going to be more pushback, there's going to be more stress, there's going to be socioeconomic, geopolitical, and just internal strife. And this was one of them that we've been talking about as being a big one. So that's what we have for you on this special update. I know we've covered a lot. There's a lot of things that continue to move, and it's obviously very fluid, especially as we go and find out more about Nord Stream and how Iran is going to continue to develop. So in the next, this is going to come out separately, and then we're going to have our macroeconomic show right behind it. So again, if you have any questions, reach out in our comment section. You can find me on Twitter, or obviously by email. And thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Prime Vision Network.